The night was dark and cold on the edge of the ruined city. The sky was filled with thick smoke and red flashes from distant explosions. The ground shook every now and then, but it was not the sound of hope. It was the sign that war still raged, somewhere far away. In the middle of this broken world, a small alien child hid beneath a fallen piece of metal, hugging her knees tightly to her chest. Her name was Mila. She was not like the others on this planet. Mila's skin was a soft blue, her eyes large and bright, almost shining in the darkness. Her small hands shook, but she was too afraid to cry anymore. Days had passed since her world turned upside down. Her parents, and all the others from her ship, had vanished in the chaos of the attack. She remembered running, being pulled along, by someone, and then the shouting and the fire. When she finally looked around, she was alone. No one came back for her. Not her people, not the rescuers, not even the soldiers who passed through the city after the fighting. Mila learned quickly that to be seen was to be chased away or ignored. Once, a group of alien mercenaries spotted her while she searched for water. They laughed and pointed but left her alone, calling her trouble and saying, "Let someone else take care of that one." Later, when she tried to follow a group of her own kind, they simply ran faster and disappeared into the shadows. It was as if the whole galaxy had decided Mila was too much trouble, too small to matter, and too different to help. Still, she tried to survive. She found a broken vending machine and learned how to pry it open to get a little food. She drank rainwater from a dirty puddle and slept wherever she thought she could be safe for a few hours. Each night, Mila watched the lights in the sky and wished someone would come for her. One morning, as the sun rose and the cold faded just a little, Mila heard a new sound. Footsteps, slow and heavy, like someone carrying a big weight. She froze, afraid it was a raider or another angry survivor. But then she heard a voice, deep and tired, talking to itself. "Come on, you can't stop now. Just a few more blocks. Find some shelter. Patch yourself up. Keep moving." Mila peeked from behind her metal hiding place and saw him, a human soldier, alone and limping. His uniform was dirty and torn, and he carried a small pack over one shoulder. His face had a fresh bruise and a cut across his cheek, but his eyes were alert, always watching the shadows. Mila had seen humans before, but never this close. The soldier stopped and leaned against a wall, breathing hard. He opened his pack and pulled out a piece of bread, chewing slowly. Then he looked around, and that's when he saw her. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Mila felt her heart race, but she didn't run. Maybe she was just too tired. Maybe she thought it didn't matter anymore. The soldier didn't shout or pull out a weapon. Instead, he raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. "Hey there," he said softly. "Are you hungry?" Mila stared at him, unsure if she should trust him. No one had offered her food since she was left behind. She didn't answer, but her eyes stayed on the bread. The soldier tore off a small piece and placed it on the ground, then backed away. "It's for you," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you." Slowly, Mila crawled out and snatched the bread. She ate it fast, her hands shaking. The soldier watched her with sad eyes. "There's more if you want," he said, holding out another piece. She moved closer, still ready to run if he tried anything. But he just sat down on the ground, tired and quiet. "What's your name?" he asked. Mila hesitated, then whispered, "Mila!" He smiled a little. "My name's Dan." He pulled a small bottle of water from his pack and gave it to her. "Where are your people?" Mila looked away, her voice small. "Gone. Left me." Dan nodded, as if he understood more. Then he led on. "War makes people do things they wouldn't do. But you shouldn't be alone out here." Mila looked at him, searching his face for a lie. She saw only honesty, and maybe a little pain. As the morning light grew stronger, Dan looked at his map, then back at Mila. "There's a place a few miles from here, old supply depot. I was headed there to get help." He hesitated. "You can come with me if you want. It'll be safer than here." Mila didn't answer, but she stood up and followed him when he started to walk. Dan didn't move too fast. He glanced over his shoulder often, making sure Mila kept up. Sometimes they had to hide when patrol ships flew overhead or when strange voices echoed through the empty buildings. As they moved through the city, Dan shared what little food he had, never asking for anything in return. He talked to Mila in a gentle way, telling her stories of Earth and what humans used to do before the war. Mila listened, feeling something she hadn't felt in days, a little bit of hope. At one point, they heard shouting nearby. A group of survivors, angry and desperate, searching for supplies. Dan pressed his finger to his lips and Mila nodded. Together, they hid in a small room until the noise faded. After that, Mila stayed closer to Dan, trusting him a little more. As the day went on, Mila noticed that Dan was hurt worse than he let on. His limp grew worse, and he had to rest often. But he never complained, and he never let her feel afraid. When they stopped, he checked his wounds and even let Mila help clean a cut on his arm. He smiled at her efforts, saying, "See, you're stronger than you think." By the time the sun began to set, they reached the edge of the city. The old supply depot was in sight, a small hope in a world that had forgotten kindness. Dan let Mila go inside first, making sure it was safe. They found a corner to rest, sharing the last of their food. Mila curled up in a blanket Dan gave her, feeling safe for the first time since the attack. That night, as Dan kept watch and Mila drifted to sleep, both felt that something important had started. In a galaxy where everyone else had turned away, a human soldier had chosen to stay. For the first time, Mila believed she might not be alone anymore. The next morning, Mila woke to the gentle sound of someone humming. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then she saw Dan, the human soldier, sitting on the cold floor by the old supply depot's window, his back against the wall. Sunlight filtered in through the broken glass, painting soft shapes on the ground. Mila felt something she had not felt in days. She felt safe. Dan looked tired but peaceful. He had stayed awake most of the night, watching over her and listening for trouble. His eyes, though ringed with exhaustion, were alert and kind. When Mila stirred, he smiled at her. "Good morning, Mila," he said softly. "Did you sleep okay?" She nodded, pulling the old blanket around her shoulders. Her stomach grumbled and Dan chuckled. "Don't worry, I saved a little breakfast for you." He handed her a small pack with a few pieces of dried fruit and a cracker. Mila ate slowly, savoring every bite. As she ate, Dan looked through his supplies. He had just a few rations left, a small amount of water, and a first aid kit that was almost empty. He checked his injured leg, wincing a little but saying nothing. Mila watched him, noticing the pain in his face. "Does it hurt?" she asked quietly. Dan shrugged. "Just a little. I'll be fine. We just need to keep moving today." Mila nodded, knowing by now that Dan would never admit if something was truly wrong. She looked at the walls around them, covered with old signs in different languages. Some said, "Emergency shelter," or "Supply room." But most of the rooms were empty now. The only thing left was dust and silence. They finished their small meal and packed up quickly. Dan checked the door, peeking out into the empty street. The world outside looked even more broken in the daylight. Windows were shattered, cars and small transports were abandoned in the roads, and strange creatures scavenged for food in the shadows. Dan motioned for Mila to stay close. "We have to be careful," he whispered. "Sometimes patrols pass through here. If we're lucky, we won't run into any trouble." They walked quietly through the streets, sticking to the shadows and avoiding open spaces. Mila's small steps made almost no sound, but Dan's limp slowed him down. Still, he kept a careful watch, looking for any sign of danger. As they moved, Mila grew curious about her protector. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dan looked at her for a moment, thinking. "Because it's the right thing to do," he answered simply. "No one deserves to be left alone, especially not a child. Sometimes the universe forgets how to be kind, but that doesn't mean we have to." Mila nodded, trying to understand his words. She felt a warmth in her chest, a feeling she thought she had lost. For the first time, she wondered if maybe she could trust someone again. They reached a narrow alley that led to a small market square. Most of the stalls were empty, but Dan spotted a few crates that looked untouched. "Wait here," he told Mila, crouching behind a broken cart. He crept forward, checking each crate for supplies. Most were empty, but in one, he found a bottle of water and a package of crackers. He smiled, showing Mila the prize. Suddenly, a voice called out from behind them. "What do you think you're doing?" Dan turned to see a group of 3 alien survivors. They looked rough and hungry, their clothes torn and faces marked by the hard life on the abandoned planet. One of them, a tall alien with green skin, stepped forward. "Those are our supplies," he said, glaring at Dan. Dan stood up, holding his hands open. "We don't want trouble. We just need a little food and water for the child," the tall alien scoffed. "She's not one of us. Let her fend for herself. If you want to live, leave her and go." Mila shrank back, fear in her eyes. Dan shook his head. "I'm not leaving her. Take what you need, but let us go." For a tense moment, no one spoke. Finally, the alien nodded. "Fine. Take the water, but leave the food." Dan agreed, handing back the crackers and leading Mila away with the bottle of water. They walked quickly. Dan's jaw clenched in frustration. Mila looked up at him. "Why did they hate me?" she asked. Dan sighed. "People are scared. When they're scared, they stop caring about others. It's not your fault." As the day grew hotter, they found shelter in an old school building. Desks and chairs were piled in a corner, and the air smelled of dust and old memories. Dan found a small med kit in the nurse's office and used it to clean his wound better. Mila watched, then quietly handed him a clean cloth. "Thank you," Dan said, smiling at her. "You're brave, Mila." She blushed, her cheeks turning a lighter shade of blue. "You're braver," she whispered. They rested for a while. Dan told Mila stories of Earth, of green trees, blue oceans, and families who laughed together. Mila listened, imagining a world so different from this one. Soon, loud engines echoed through the streets. Dan peered out and saw a patrol ship flying low, searching for survivors or rebels. He quickly pulled Mila into a closet, holding her close and covering her mouth gently so she wouldn't make a sound. The patrol passed by, but it stopped near the school. Soldiers in dark armor jumped out, searching the building. Dan whispered, "Stay quiet. Don't move." He waited, holding his breath as footsteps grew louder. The soldiers searched every room, talking in a language Mila didn't understand. They found nothing, and soon their voices faded. When the danger passed, Dan and Mila stayed hidden a little longer, just to be safe. When they finally stepped out, Mila looked at Dan with wide eyes. "How did you know what to do?" Dan smiled. "Soldiers have to learn how to hide. I was taught to protect people. I promised myself I would keep you safe." Mila felt proud to be with Dan. For the first time, she didn't feel like a burden. She felt like she belonged. As evening fell, Dan checked his map. "There's an old train tunnel a few miles from here. It leads under the city and out to the hills. If we can make it there, we'll be safer." Mila agreed. They left the school, moving carefully through the fading light. The streets grew quieter as the sun set, and soon they reached the tunnel entrance. It was dark inside, but Dan's flashlight showed the way. As they walked through the tunnel, Mila held Dan's hand tightly. Strange noises echoed around them, but Dan's presence made her feel safe. He talked softly, telling her about the stars and the places they would see when they were free. Finally, they reached the end of the tunnel. Outside, the hills stretched far into the distance, covered in wild grass and scattered trees. Mila took a deep breath, feeling hope rise in her heart. Dan smiled at her. "We made it, Mila. Just a little further, and we'll find help." They set up camp under a tree, sharing the last of their water and watching the stars appear. Mila curled up beside Dan, feeling safe and cared for. As she drifted to sleep, she whispered, "Thank you for not leaving me." Dan looked at the stars and answered softly, "I'll never leave you, Mila." "You're not alone anymore." And for the first time in a long while, Mila believed him. The sun rose slowly over the hills, warming the cold ground where Dan and Mila had slept. Birds sang somewhere in the distance, and a soft breeze made the tall grass dance. Mila woke up to the sound of Dan quietly packing his bag. He glanced at her and smiled. "Good morning, Mila," he said, his voice gentle. "Did you sleep well?" Mila rubbed her eyes and nodded. She felt much better now. The night had passed without trouble, and she no longer woke up afraid. Being beside Dan made her feel protected. She remembered his promise. "I'll never leave you, Mila. You're not alone anymore." Those words stayed in her heart. Dan checked his map and looked at the empty water bottle. "We need to find water and some food today. There's a small river not far from here, and maybe we can find some berries or roots." He smiled to cheer her up. "Ready for an adventure?" Mila giggled softly. She was ready. She followed Dan through the grass, staying close to his side. The hills were peaceful, and the world felt bigger out here than inside the broken city. As they walked, Dan pointed out things Mila had never seen before. A rabbit running into a bush, wildflowers opening in the sun, and a bird building its nest in a tree. They reached the river by noon. The water sparkled, and Dan knelt down to fill their bottle. He handed Mila a cup. "Here, drink slowly. River water can be cold." Mila sipped the water, feeling refreshed. She watched Dan as he looked for safe places to cross. "Do you think we'll find help soon?" she asked. Dan nodded. "I hope so. There's an old emergency outpost on the other side of these hills. If it's still working, we can send a signal and maybe someone will come." They sat by the river and ate wild berries that Dan showed her how to pick. Mila loved the sweet taste and the way the juice stained her fingers purple. For a while, it felt almost like a picnic, not an escape from a dangerous world. As they rested, Dan checked his wounded leg. The cut looked worse today, and Mila could see pain on his face. She wanted to help, so she tore a piece of her own blanket and wrapped it gently around his leg. "Thank you, Mila," Dan whispered. "You're very kind." Just as they finished eating, a strange sound broke the quiet, the whine of an engine. Dan's face grew serious. "Hide," he said, motioning for Mila to crawl under a thick bush. He crouched beside her, keeping low. A small patrol drone hovered overhead, scanning the area with a red light. Dan kept perfectly still, his hand gently holding Mila's shoulder. The drone passed by, but it made Mila's heart race. After it was gone, Dan waited a long minute before moving again. "That was close," he said quietly. "Someone's still searching these hills. We have to be extra careful now." They moved on, sticking to the shadows and low ground. The hills grew steeper, and Dan's limp got worse. Mila offered her arm to help him walk. Dan smiled and leaned on her, grateful for her support. Together they moved slowly but surely. As they climbed higher, the view opened up. Mila could see the city far behind them, and in the distance, a broken tower. "What's that?" she asked. Dan studied the tower. "That's the old emergency outpost. If we can get there, we might be able to call for help, but it looks damaged." He frowned, worried. They reached the outpost just as the sun began to set. Up close, the building looked sad and lonely. Parts of it were burned, and a few walls had collapsed. Dan checked the door and pushed it open. Inside, dust floated in the air, and old equipment lay scattered on the floor. "Stay close, Mila," Dan whispered. He searched the rooms carefully. Most of the computers didn't work, but he found an old radio with a cracked screen. Dan knelt beside it and tried to fix the wires. Mila explored quietly. She found a box of supplies, some canned food, bandages, and a flashlight. "Dan, look!" she called. Dan's eyes lit up. "You're a real explorer," he said, opening the box and giving Mila a small can of fruit. "This will help us tonight." Worked on the radio for a long time, his hands steady but slow. Mila watched as he twisted wires and tapped buttons. Finally, a faint static noise filled the air. "Is it working?" Mila asked, hope shining in her eyes. Dan nodded. "Maybe. I'll try to send a signal." He pressed the button and spoke into the radio. "This is Corporal Dan Hunter, Human Alliance. I have a child with me requesting immediate rescue. Please respond. Repeat. Requesting immediate rescue." They waited, but only static answered back. Dan tried again, his voice calm but urgent. Mila held his hand, feeling his worry. As night fell, Dan set up a small camp in the safest room. They ate the canned food Mila had found. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, Mila felt warm beside Dan. Before sleeping, Dan cleaned his wound with the bandages. Mila helped, handing him supplies and keeping his spirits up with her gentle smile. "We'll be okay," she said quietly. "Someone will come." Dan nodded, even though he wasn't sure. "Yes, Mila, we'll be okay." In the middle of the night, a voice crackled on the radio. It was faint, but clear. "Dan Hunter, this is Alliance Outpost Bravo. We hear you. Hold position. Rescue team on the way." Dan and Mila both sat up, hope filling their hearts. Dan answered, "Thank you. We'll wait at the emergency outpost." Mila hugged Dan, her eyes shining with relief. "They're coming," she whispered. But just as they felt safe, new trouble arrived. Outside, lights flickered. Vehicles approaching the outpost. Dan peered through a broken window and saw several figures. They weren't Alliance soldiers. They were raiders, drawn by the radio signal or maybe just searching for loot. Dan's face grew serious again. "We have to hide, Mila. Stay quiet and don't move, no matter what." He found a hidden spot in the back room, behind a heavy metal cabinet. He and Mila squeezed together, hearts pounding. Outside, the raiders broke open the front door, shouting to each other as they searched for anything valuable. They ransacked the rooms, tossing equipment and shouting in rough voices. Dan held Mila close, covering her mouth gently to keep her quiet. One of the raiders came close to their hiding spot, but didn't look behind the cabinet. After a long, tense wait, the raiders left, taking whatever they could carry. Mila let out a shaky breath, her eyes wide with fear. Dan hugged her. "It's okay. They're gone. You were very brave." As dawn approached, the rescue team's ship finally appeared in the sky. Dan helped Mila stand, and together they walked out to meet their rescuers. The Alliance team rushed to help them, checking Dan's wounds and giving Mila a warm blanket. Mila looked back at the outpost and then at Dan. She knew that even though the world was full of danger, she had found someone who would never leave her. Together, they had survived another day, and now, maybe, they had a real chance for a new life. Mila held tightly onto Dan's hand as the Alliance rescue team helped them aboard the ship. The doors slid shut with a soft whoosh, cutting off the cold morning wind and the memories of fear outside. Inside the rescue craft, it was warm and filled with a low, comforting hum. For a moment, Mila and Dan just sat together, letting the relief wash over them. The medics checked Dan's wounds first. One of them, a woman with kind brown eyes, knelt in front of him. "You're lucky you made it this far," she said gently. "This leg needs proper care, but you did a good job patching it up. And you—" She turned to Mila with a smile. "You must be very brave." Mila looked away shyly, but Dan squeezed her shoulder. "She's the bravest kid I've ever met," he said. While the medics worked, one of the rescue team's officers sat across from Dan. "We got your message," he said, voice calm and firm. "You saved the child and survived out there on your own. That's not easy, but you should know there's trouble brewing. Raiders and mercenaries are growing bold in this area. We need to move fast." Dan nodded. "We had a close call last night," he replied. "But Mila, she's not safe anywhere alone. I promised I wouldn't leave her." The officer's eyes softened. "Don't worry. We'll protect her." He gave Mila a reassuring look, but Mila stayed close to Dan, feeling safer with his presence. The ship flew smoothly above the hills and away from the ruined city. Mila looked out the small window, watching the world shrink below them. For the first time in days, she felt hope that things might be better. The rescue team brought them to a secure Alliance base. Inside, there were bright lights, clean hallways, and busy people who seemed calm and sure of themselves. Mila clung to Dan, nervous around the strangers and loud sounds. Dan put his arm around her and whispered, "It's all right. This is a good place." They were led to a small room where they could rest. Mila was given fresh clothes and a hot meal, soup, bread, and sweet fruit juice. Dan watched her eat with a smile. It was the first time she ate without fear, savoring every bite. After they finished, a gentle caretaker came in to help Mila take a shower and get clean. She was shy, but the woman was patient and kind, humming a quiet song that reminded Mila of her mother. When she came back, Dan almost didn't recognize her with her hair brushed and new clothes. Later, Dan's wounds were treated in the base medical center. He limped a little less, thanks to the care he received. Mila stayed by his side, holding his hand. The doctors and nurses smiled at her, amazed by the way she trusted Dan and how calm she was when he was nearby. As the sun set, Dan and Mila were taken to meet the base commander. He was a tall, older man with gray hair and sharp eyes. He looked at Dan first, then Mila, and finally nodded. "I've heard about your bravery, Corporal," he said to Dan. "Not many would risk their lives for a child, especially one from another species." Dan shrugged. "She needed help." "That's all that mattered." The commander looked thoughtful. "There's been trouble between our people and Mila's. Some don't want us working together. But what you did, it shows that we can be better." He turned to Mila and spoke gently. "Do you remember anything about your family? Your home? We can try to find them for you." Mila looked down, her voice small. "They left. I don't know why. I just want to stay with Dan." The commander nodded slowly. "We'll respect your wishes. But until things are safe, you'll both need to stay here. We'll keep you together." He smiled a little, making Mila feel more at ease. Days passed at the base. Mila learned to trust the people there. She helped in the kitchen, folding napkins and setting out trays, and sometimes listened to the scientists talking about the stars. The base had a small schoolroom, and a friendly teacher started to teach her simple things: letters, numbers, and words in the human language. Mila was a fast learner, and the teacher said she was one of the brightest children she had ever taught. Dan spent his days helping the rescue teams. Even though his leg was healing slowly, he showed new soldiers how to read maps and stay safe. Sometimes, he and Mila would walk outside at night, looking up at the stars and talking about what the future might hold. One afternoon, a group of visitors came to the base. They wore uniforms from several different worlds. Some were human, some were from other alien races. They were part of the Galactic Council, the group in charge of peace talks and making big decisions. They wanted to see Mila, the abandoned child who had survived with a human soldier. The visitors sat with Dan and Mila in a bright room. They asked many questions. What happened on the day of the crash, how she survived, and why Dan had helped her. Mila answered softly, but with more confidence than before. Dan saved me. No one else would. He gave me food, he kept me warm, and he never left me behind. I don't know why people are afraid. I just know Dan is kind. The council members listened, nodding. One of them, a blue-skinned woman, leaned forward. Do you want to go home, Mila? We can find your people if that's what you wish. Mila looked at Dan, then shook her head. I want to stay with Dan. He's my family now, the council members whispered among themselves. Finally, the leader spoke. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is care for someone who is different. Maybe we can learn from you both. After the meeting, Dan hugged Mila. You did great, he said proudly. I just told the truth, Mila answered. As the days went by, stories about Dan and Mila spread around the Alliance. People started to talk about their bravery and how kindness could change the galaxy. Some called Dan a hero. Others were surprised that a human would risk so much for an alien child. But for Dan and Mila, none of that mattered. They were just glad to be safe and together. One night, alarms sounded at the base. Dan woke up quickly, pulling on his boots. Stay here, Mila, he said, his voice serious. I'll check what's happening. But Mila followed him quietly, too worried to be left alone. In the hallway, they heard soldiers talking. Raiders had been spotted near the outer wall. Dan and Mila hurried to a window. Outside, small ships flashed in the darkness, firing at the base's shields. Dan grabbed a radio and called for help. We need backup at the south gate, he shouted. Mila, thinking fast, remembered a trick Dan taught her, how to lock doors from the control room. She rushed to the panel and pressed the buttons just as raiders tried to break in. The doors slammed shut, blocking the attackers. Dan watched proudly as Mila worked. You're a hero, Mila, he whispered. The soldiers fought off the raiders. After a long hour, the alarms finally stopped. The base was safe again. When it was over, the commander called Dan and Mila to his office. You both saved lives tonight, he said. I want everyone here to remember your courage. Mila smiled shyly, holding Dan's hand. Dan put his arm around her, knowing that together they could face anything. The galaxy was still dangerous, and not everyone would understand their friendship. But Dan and Mila had found family in each other, and that made them stronger than anyone could imagine. Life at the Alliance base slowly became more peaceful after the raider attack. Mila began to smile more, her days filled with new routines and quiet happiness. Every morning, she joined Dan for breakfast in the busy mess hall, where laughter echoed off metal walls and friendly faces greeted them. Mila felt safe here, surrounded by people who cared, but she was always happiest when Dan was near. As the weeks passed, Mila learned many things. She could read simple words, solve math puzzles, and even draw pictures of the strange animals Dan described from Earth, lions, bears, and dolphins. The other children at the base began to play with her too. They liked her stories and her gentle smile. Some were human, others were from different planets, but Mila made friends with them all. Dan watched her with pride. His own days were busy as well. Now that his leg was almost healed, he trained new recruits and went on short rescue missions. He was careful never to leave for too long and always promised Mila, I'll be back before you know it. Each time he returned, Mila would run and hug him tightly, never doubting his promise. One afternoon, while Mila sat in the sun drawing in her notebook, Dan joined her with 2 cups of cold juice. He handed her one and sat beside her. What are you drawing? He asked. Us, Mila answered, showing him the picture. It showed a tall figure with a gentle smile and a small blue child holding his hand. Above them, she'd drawn a bright sun and a field of flowers. Dan smiled and ruffled her hair. "That's perfect," he said softly. "You're quite the artist." Suddenly, a messenger hurried over, holding a small electronic tablet. "Dan, Mila," she said, "the council wants to see you both right away." They followed her to the council chamber, a big, bright room filled with important people from many worlds. The council leader, the blue-skinned woman from before, welcomed them with a kind smile. "Thank you for coming," she said. Another council member spoke. "We have news, Mila. We found people from your home world. They're alive and safe. They sent a message. They want to meet you." Mila's eyes widened. For a moment, she said nothing. Dan knelt beside her and asked, "How do you feel?" Mila looked at Dan, her eyes full of questions. "What should I do?" she whispered. Dan gave her a gentle smile. "You have a choice, Mila. You can meet them if you want, or you can stay here with me. Whatever you choose, I'll support you." The council leader spoke softly. "There's no rush. You can take your time to decide." Mila thought hard that night. She remembered her old family, her mother's songs, her father's laugh, but those memories felt far away now. She remembered the cold nights alone, the fear and the emptiness. Most of all, she remembered Dan's kindness. He had saved her, never leaving her side when everyone else turned away. He was her family now. The next morning, Mila found Dan in the training yard helping young soldiers. She waited until he finished, then ran to him. "Dan, can we talk?" They sat together on a bench under a small tree. Mila took a deep breath. "I want to meet them, but I don't want to leave you. You're my family too." Dan smiled. "Then, let's meet them together. And if you want, you can stay with both, your old family and your new one." Mila hugged Dan tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. She felt lighter than she had in a long time. A few days later, the Alliance arranged a meeting with Mila's people. They arrived on a small ship, wearing bright clothes and carrying gifts from Mila's home world. Her mother and father ran to her, kneeling down and hugging her tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Mila felt their love, but she also felt something new, a strong, quiet courage inside her. She was not the same little girl who had been lost and afraid. Her parents thanked Dan, bowing deeply. "You saved our daughter. We can never repay you." Dan shook his head. "Mila saved herself. I just helped." The council members spoke to Mila's family, explaining how Dan had cared for her and how Mila had grown brave and strong. They suggested that Mila could stay at the Alliance base for now, learning and making friends, with visits to her family whenever she wished. Her parents agreed, wanting only what was best for her. As the days went on, Mila split her time between her two families. She spent many evenings with her parents, learning about her culture and language, but every night she returned to Dan, sharing stories, meals, and laughter. Sometimes Dan would read to her before bed, his calm voice helping her drift into peaceful dreams. The base changed, too. News of Dan and Mila's story spread across the Alliance and beyond. People began to question old fears and prejudices. Some who had once avoided helping others started to volunteer, reaching out to those who were different or alone. Mila became a symbol of hope, showing that kindness could bring people together when nothing else could. One day, as Dan and Mila walked in the garden, a group of new recruits came up to them. One asked, "How did you find the courage to help, even when everyone else walked away?" Dan thought for a moment. "Sometimes, courage isn't about fighting battles. Sometimes, it's just about not leaving someone behind. Even if you're scared or tired or alone, you stay, because it's the right thing to do." Mila nodded, adding, "And sometimes, you find family in the most unexpected places." As the sun set that evening, Mila and Dan sat together watching the stars. Mila leaned her head on Dan's shoulder. "Do you think things will ever get better in the galaxy?" she asked. Dan smiled softly. "I think so. As long as there are people willing to care, there's always hope." Mila watched the sky, thinking of her long journey. She remembered the pain and the fear, but now she felt peace and strength. She knew that the world could still be hard, but she wasn't alone anymore. She had Dan, she had her parents, and she had hope for the future. And somewhere, far beyond the stars, the story of a human soldier who refused to walk away, and the alien child who found a new family, continued to inspire others. It reminded everyone that true courage and kindness could change the galaxy, one act at a time. The end.